Bruiser build I put together, and then we're gonna also explain the thought process behind how gemming usually works in New World. So this Bruiser build, for the highlights of it, you used to run 300 to 350 con. That gave you grit reduction and it gave you grit. I would argue those aren't mandatory perks right now, and you can drop your con. I'm being really aggressive with this build and dropping it to 200 con, which is the lowest you'd ever want to go, and put all the rest of the points in strength. That will allow you to do more damage, but you'll be a little bit more squishy. That being said, we have tricks with our gear to keep up with the damage and be a little bit tankier than you normally would be. So the gemming trick that we're going for here is going for a 5-15 split. Actually, let me boot up my epic pen real quick. Because as we just explained this on a stream, but for people that watch the VOD back or the video, the general idea when it comes to gemming is you only have 3 different types of physical gems, right? And you have a lot of different types of elemental gems. And you have things like protections and you have conditionings that only work versus one type of gem. So it's usually best to sacrifice one of your physical stats that you're not going to go against. For 90% of players, this is going to be strike damage that you want to sacrifice. But for large-scale PvP, it could be thrust damage. You sacrifice that stat, and then you use conditionings to supplement the other stat along with using your gem slot, which would be contained in an amulet, which I don't have on this amulet. But I think I have a different amulet with one. Okay, I got rid of it. But like if you have like strike protection on your amulet, or if you have thrust protection on your amulet, you use that. Use slash conditioning to supplement the slash, and then you're basically good versus physical, and then just do a 5-15 physical / elemental gem split. So that will give you the most coverage. There are some builds in particular that try to use 2 conditionings. So I think this Bruiser one, we have thrust conditioning and we have slash conditioning because both of those are used in PvP to some extent. So that's something else that's kind of noteworthy that might be helpful. So for this one, we went with Elemental Aversion for Bruiser as our defensive perk. Elemental Aversion is a really strong defensive perk in PvP because it helps versus Fire Staff, which is relatively strong, always has been strong, always will be strong. And it also helps versus Detonate extremely well because Detonate has 0 base damage, so this is actually a 4.5% damage reduction. Usually Elemental Aversion is closer to like a 2 to 3% damage reduction because classes tend to have passive base damage. So that's something we go from there. We also need to hit 3 freedom generally with a Bruiser sort of setup, otherwise it just tends to feel a little bit uncomfortable. I tried to sneak in a Thorny Reflection as well. A Thorny Reflection just allows you to get your ult a little bit faster, which for Bruisers is really, really important. And also, it does a decent amount of damage. Like, it's surprising how much damage that deals. I also put in a Hasted Vigor in here as well, because I feel like that's kind of a nice thing to run. So we end up with 3 slash conditioning, 1 thrust conditioning. Honestly, I think it's better to have 2 thrust conditionings with Bruiser, because there are spear players that play around the point. So we are getting thrust and we're getting slash conditioning with this kind of setup. Oh, wait. No, that's just... No, we can't do that. Never mind. We only have slots for 3 conditionings. So, unless we sacrifice another elemental aversion, which actually probably is worth doing for this sort of setup, because we want to make sure that we're not just dying to one of those things. And elemental aversion, I think, is a little bit less important for this build, but it's still really nice to have. So, what do we end up with here? We end up with 3 elemental aversions, 2 slash conditioning, 2 thrust conditioning, and 3 freedoms. You have a passive freedom from being in medium. If you're a heavy player, you can go down to 2 freedom, and then you have another slot to use towards conditioning, elemental aversion, or one of these other like kind of useful perks. So that's something that is kind of noteworthy there. Could you upgrade artifacts to 725? Yeah, you could upgrade artifacts to 725 now. For our Bruiser tree, we're going with Shockwave, Path of Destiny, and Armor Breaker. This is very standard. Nothing has really changed here that much. Main idea with Bruiser is it's heavy CC with the Warhammer, and Great Axe is used for damage combos. Now, Great Axe you don't want to be on as much anymore because you don't have passive grip from your light attacks, so you're basically a Warhammer main. Like, I'd call this a Warhammer Great Axe build now, not a Great Axe Warhammer, because you should be maining the Warhammer and your Great Axe should be a secondary weapon. There are some tricks though, like you could go for heavy attacks, try to pull people, and then when you pull people, you apply a root. So like there are times to use the Great Axe, but it's just not as common of a tech anymore. Tumbler Feet Wraps is very, very good. There's an illegal sandworm piece called the Sandlion Coxa that I would recommend getting for most Bruiser players. If you're not able to get this, you have another perk slot that you could use defensively. And then if the more defensive perk slots that you have, the lower you can drop your con. If this con feels too low for you, definitely just bump up the con. But if you have worse gear, you'll need higher con, and if you have better gear, you can probably get away with lower con and do more damage. So that's something that's kind of noteworthy there. On our ring, we have strike damage instead of slash damage, which is a little controversial, but I think that will help overall with our damage output. I think this is a little bit flexible of a slot. Like you can go slash, you can go strike. You maybe could even go invigorated punishment. I feel like that's a little bit weird, but you can do something like that. Empowering cleave is also a new perk that they added, but it feels like it's likely super inconsistent, so I wouldn't really force it. So there is a type of melee attack. There's another variant of this build, right, where you go for the spin to win, whirling kind of great axe build. For that build in particular, Empowering Cleave isn't terrible, but you already have so many sources of Empower where it's probably not worth running Empowering Cleave, but you are going to hit multiple people at the same time with your attacks. So that's something that's like another aspect that you could build around with the Bruiser, but I don't think it's particularly worth it. Stand passive, not worth it in my opinion. Which one is that? Is it Great Axe? Oh, this one? I mean, it's like basically as good as stand recovery now on a 20-second cooldown. Like, surely it's not terrible. Does Thorny work on ranged attacks? I'm not sure if it works on ranged attacks or not. It doesn't matter for this build, but that's something that I need to test. It's something that I also just like can't really get a piece to test with Thorny Reflection, so that's been kind of the issue there. Like if I look for Thorny Reflection on the TP, I don't think there's any gear with this right now. So it's like, you can't easily test with it. I was able to get the mod, but then I need to craft gear, and crafting gear is like super, super expensive right now, so it's something I haven't really been able to confirm. But for melee-oriented builds, like you're probably going to get hit, so I think it works. Bruisers have to survive on point. 200 isn't viable. If you aren't on point, you don't need that much con. So it depends where you are, right? Like this is a sample roster that I wanted to go over or like later in the stream to get more people in. But like, if you're on the point team, yes, you're going to need higher con. If you're like in a quadrant group, particularly near the back of the point, you definitely can go with lower con. Like you don't need super high con for these bottom left and bottom right quad groups. But for like top left and top right, you might need higher con. For point, you might need higher con. It depends where you play. It's something that you definitely have to play with. But as a default, I would try to go for lower con, limit test, and then up your con as needed, if that makes sense. Because if you go the other way around, you won't know how low you can drop your con until you try lower con. So it makes sense to start at a lower bound and work your way up, rather than an upper bound and work your way down and kind of limit test it, if that makes sense. It's like, that's how I would go about it. But these are sample trees. Like, they might need a little adjusting. Like Crush is saying that you don't necessarily need the stamina. I think this is like a pretty good perk. You might not want to have like this pull for root thing, although it feels insane right now, to be honest. It's also 1 second cooldown in each target, not on yourself, which is also insane. So this got like super, super buffed. It makes Great Axe play like a lot differently. I wouldn't be surprised in the future if we start seeing people like even like run Reap or like other ways to like utilize this pull a little bit more effectively. The main thing with Bruiser, hit 3 freedom, hit your conditioning thresholds that you may feel comfortable with. I think this is round 2 of thrust and slash, and then use strike protection on your amulet, because you're mostly going to be taking damage from bruisers. If you are playing this kind of class in OPR, you will be taking mostly thrust damage, so I would change this. I would go for a thrust damage amulet, and then you could probably drop the thrust conditioning, put in a little bit more slash, and you have more defensive perks freed up, if that makes sense. So it's like, it's a little bit flexible depending on what kind of modes you play. I know not everyone plays in War, but this is specifically a build that is very commonly used in War. One other thing to talk about here too is we did put in one teardrop here. Teardrop is like one of the best earrings in the game and is super, super underrated for a lot of builds. Bruiser is one of those where a lot of the times Bruisers are worried about getting their cooldowns up, and if you're worried about getting your cooldowns up in time and you have really long cooldowns, the most efficient perk to slot in order to get CDR quickly is Refreshing Ward. Even though it is something that you can't consistently get, you still can get Teardrop right now. You need to run 7 BNBs, salvage the Cannon Heart Runes, and then you're going to be able to craft the Teardrop. Teardrop is insane. I run it on like every single build basically, and it feels wonderful. The other one that is like relatively good that some people talk about right now too is Deckhand. Deckhand's something you get from the main story quest, a little bit easier to obtain. Gives you a lot of empower. I don't think you need more sources of empower on Bruiser, but if you're worried about extra weekends because people are running more artifact flails now than they used to, this is another option as well. I hate saying this, but I legit think not taking a gravity passive might be troll. Yeah, I mean, it's changed a lot, right? Like, most bruisers that used to play the game, like, 2 months ago, like, didn't think that passive was useful at all, and the devs basically came out and said, oh, yeah, we looked at it, and the passive's triggering way too early to the point where it's not useful at all, so we're going to adjust that. So it's like, that passive is, like, way better now because it's lasting for more frames, and it's in a different spot than it used to be. Thoughts on Lightning Bruiser this season? It is a tech option. It's not really something that's used a lot because you can't get the passives that you want on your Warhammer and your Great Axe, which I want to talk about now. On your Warhammer particularly, you pretty much always want Sundering Shockwave. If you have people with this on their armor and you have people on the weapon, they will override each other, so it makes sense to have your entire roster just put it on either the armor or on the weapon. Most people prefer to put this on the weapon because it's an extra 5% rend. If you put this on an armor, it's 10%, so that's another source of damage output for your entire army. Trenchant Strikes is really good because you try to go for a lot of heavy attacks, and Plague Strikes is really good because you try to go for a lot of heavy attacks. If you go that Lightning Bruiser, you can't necessarily build out Trenchant Strikes and Plague Strikes on the Warhammer, so it becomes a lot more awkward to use the Warhammer because you're doing less damage with each heavy attack. If people are over-gemming, though, to strike damage, like if they have 20% gems to strike for whatever reason and 0% chance or 0 gems to lightning, then yes, it can be worth going for it, but that's why I say it's a tech option. It depends on the matchup. There's other weapons like bow that specifically just default to using bolt caster because everyone runs thrust protection, but people don't run as much lightning, so it's like it's kind of works the opposite for that kind of class. Great Axe, Enfeebling Maelstrom is a must-have, Refreshing Move is a must-have, last slot is very flexible. I put Thwarting Counter on here. It has a big number. You're not going to have grit half the time you're going for Great Axe stuff right now, so it's like, I don't know what to put for this slot, to be honest. I'm a little bit lost on what to put for that slot. Like, I think Shirking's okay, but it only applies to one attack, right? And then, like, Attunement's okay, but it only applies to one attack. It's not as good in, like, group play, and there's not other slots that are, like, really that useful because you don't have your proc perk open because you have to run a Refreshing Move on Bruiser. So, like, it's in a weird spot where it's like, I don't know necessarily what to play. Like, maybe if you want to go for heavy attacks a little bit more because they apply a root now, like Trenchant Strikes isn't a bad option, but it's something that I don't feel comfortable, like, saying is necessarily best, but this is an option that seems like it's okay. Rogue seems like a pretty good perk, to be honest, because you typically are hitting people at the back with Great Axe, so maybe I'll lock that one in instead. I feel like that will proc a little bit more, but it's like, I don't know what to go exactly for that option. Each Bruiser aims for grit and clump, so counter seems fine. Yeah, it's like, I think counter's okay, I think rogue's okay. I don't know what else in here seems that good, though. Like, I think I'm going to lock in rogue for now, but I think counter also makes sense. Enchanted is back. Yeah, I guess you could go Enchanted, but, like, you're not really looking for auto attacks on Great Axe anymore, right? Like, Great Axe is used for clump damage now. It's not used for auto attack spamming. Your Warhammer should strictly be for auto attack spamming. Great Axe should just be basically there to do clump damage with your detonates, which is our Heart Rune. So the idea here is that you throw out a Gravwell, you charge your detonate at the same time. You go in with high Mauler's stacks or Mauler's Fury. You go for in a Maelstrom, the detonate pops and you do massive damage. Your other Bruiser, if they don't have this combo up, they need to be looking for a Shockwave to stun people and also apply that rend, which will increase damage. And then you look to finish people with the Armor Breaker. So it's like kind of a combo in itself. One other trick for Bruiser that not a lot of people talk about, and I'll talk about because I'm a tank player, it is really, really important if you are going in for a clump to try to break the tank's stamina, and no one really goes for this play except for in EU, but if you can go for a heavy attack, like if you don't have this combo, go for the heavy attack because it will chunk the tank's stamina, and go for Armor Breaker and it will just delete their shield. They lose the, like, 40% damage reduction that a tank gives, and you actually might kill something. Like, just recommendation from a tank player, it's really annoying to deal with, and it's really, really effective. You can't go for it all the time, but it is a really good mix-up and like one of those combo plays. So, but yeah, that's my general thoughts about Bruiser. What about Whirlwind? Whirlwind is good. It's another viable option. I don't think it's a standard thing that people are going to go for, but it is a very viable path to go for Bruiser. You need to go for the Whirlwind Great Axe, which is relatively easy to obtain. I believe you just get it from a trial now, so we're starting to do the raid stuff. But if you go to season trials, I think it's in here, like the Winter Rune Forge. You can get this, and this is like a really good axe, also really easy to obtain. So, like that's another way to build this. It's a little bit different, not typically as meta, but it seems like it could be effective. Can life stealing work on Great Axe though? From some extra sustain from bombing. Life stealing has a 0.1 second cooldown. You already have a good amount of self sustain from Warhammer abilities giving you life steal. I'd argue it's too much. Like you have to cook too much. You have to do the sandworm though. Oh, for the pants. Oh, for Tempest Fury to level it up, you do, or for the pants. Life stealing's in the proc perk pool. Okay, then you can't go it. Yeah, refreshing move like basically means that you can't go for half this stuff. There are some people, in particular Crush, who like have tried like not going for a refreshing move necessarily and then running like teardrop, and he said that like that gave him enough CDR to still be effective. He still dropped 20 or 30 kills in a war, but it was like a low level war. So it's like that's another option as well. Most bruisers do not go for this teardrop path. It is like objectively better than what bruisers typically go for though. Like that, there's no debate with it. It's just bruisers are lazy and don't really want to do 7 BNBs. If you do them during mutations though, it's a pretty good source of gold. Those were there last week. So it's like a little bit harder to get this now. There's another trick with getting teardrop. It's like really, really niche, but less niche now than it used to be. If you are exactly level 60 and you do a BNB, you have a chance of just getting teardrop right off the bat and you don't have to do anything. But it only drops if you're exactly level 60. So like if you're leveling up a new character for whatever reason and you're not level 60 yet, I would recommend stopping when you hit level 60, doing a normal BNB until you get this artifact, and you'll save time in the long run. There's other artifacts like that drop as well. Don't ask me why AGS coded it like this, but that's just how it works to get those nowadays. Tempest Fury gives a lot of mobility. Yeah, Tempest Fury seems like the better option in OPR too. Like it seems like a very solid option in OPR. War, I think it's a little bit more niche, but still very effective.